Good evening. Welcome this evening to St. Mark's Episcopal Church, especially those of you who are here as guests. This place is blessed by your presence, and we're certainly glad that you came out tonight. I'm going to open us this evening with prayer. Oh, gracious God, you made us in your own image. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love. And work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth. We pray this in your holy name. Amen. My name is Barclay Thompson. It's my honor and privilege to serve as the rector or the head pastor, if you're of Protestant persuasion, of this church. I want to tell you a little bit about why we're hosting this event before I introduce our speaker. Some of you will know or will have heard me deliver throughout the community a talk on the history of conflict in the Holy Land. If you've not heard that talk and you're interested in that sort of broader historical perspective, the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette had me come in and film that with their equipment. If you go to YouTube and just Google Barclay Thompson, Palestine, Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, that will be the first thing that pops up, and you'll be able to hear that 45-minute lecture, which is a historical perspective. As a result of that talk, my good friend Ali Khan asked me if we might be interested in furthering that conversation, and that's what's led to tonight's event. And I want to thank Ali. He is here somewhere, and there he is. We're so glad that he is here serving to build bridges across our interfaith community, as he does all the time when he's not saving lives as a physician, and we're so grateful to him. My own interest, other than being a Christian and a person of goodwill and a priest in the church, is that I serve as the president of the North American Committee for St. George's College in Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. That is the Anglican Center in the Holy Land. It is the center for the Anglican Communion in East Jerusalem on the campus of St. George's University, which is the Anglican Cathedral in East Jerusalem. Through that work, I have led trips to the Holy Land and will continue to do so. And certainly St. George's, along with Archbishop Hossam Nawoum, who is the first native-born Palestinian Christian to serve as Archbishop in that place, is using the college and its work to try to foster peace and justice in the land of the Holy One. I'm announcing for the first time that, God willing, I will be leading a trip to the Holy Land, to St. George's College in mid-September of next year. So especially for those who are Episcopalians here in the Diocese of Arkansas, Bishop John Harmon has endorsed that trip. And so when we begin advertising it, it will not be a St. Mark's trip. It will be a diocesan pilgrimage on which I'm serving as chaplain. And so pay attention to the communique that comes out from the diocese, so that if you would like to sign up for that, it'll be a 7-night in-country course at St. George's College. Without further ado, I want to introduce to you Dr. Ahmad Yousaf. Dr. Yousaf is a native of New Jersey. He's double board certified in internal medicine and pediatrics. He practices in Central Arkansas because apparently he gets bored easily. He also has an MBA from the Wharton School. Dr. Yousaf is the founder and operator of Rock Medical Group, a hospitalist staffing company in Central Arkansas. Dr. Yousaf has been on medical missions for refugee camps all around the world, including in Ghana, Haiti, Colombia for Venezuelan economic refugees, Greece and Jordan for Syrian refugees, and Bangladesh for Rohingya refugees. Dr. Yousaf has traveled to Gaza twice since the outbreak of war, this most recent outbreak of war. First in June of 2024 for a month, and then for 2.5 weeks this past summer. Very importantly, Dr. Yousaf is married to Angie, a craniofacial orthodontist who works at Children's Hospital, and he is the father of 3 lovely children, all of whom I have met this evening, and they're quite winsome. So without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about how tonight's event is structured, and then I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Yousaf. Dr. Yousaf's going to speak to us for 25 or 30 minutes about his experiences on the ground. And if you were a philosophy student, we'd call this part of the remarks phenomenological. That means he's just going to tell us what he saw. He's going to tell us what he experienced. He's going to tell us what it was like to be a medical care practitioner in that environment rent asunder by conflict and war. And then we're going to pause, and I'm going to come up and I'm going to remind us what's going to happen next, which is we're going to open things up to questions and answers. And I have said to Ahmad that I want him to be able to answer those questions as freely and candidly as he can. In so doing, I want you to understand that the manner in which you ask your question should be gracious. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor who said, you should never start a question by saying, "Don't you think?" Because when you begin a question that way, you are assuming what the answer should be. So I would discourage you from asking your question, "Don't you think?" Instead, ask your question in an open-ending way. Perhaps ask Dr. Yousaf, "What do you think?" rather than presupposing that you're already aware of what his response may be. I'll moderate those questions because tonight we do want to be about understanding, not rancor. And I trust that the grace of all of the Abrahamic religions and any other faith represented in this room will prevail. So without further ado, I turn things over to my new friend, Dr. Ahmad Yousaf.
Good evening. Can you hear me well? Does that sound reasonable? Project. I'll do that. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. No, they're saying nothing back there. What about here? Sounds good, huh? I don't mind holding it for now. Yeah, let's do that.
Actually, put it back on.
The elves in the back are going to help us here. Testing. Oh, that's good, I think, right? All right. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, all praise and glory and thanks due to God alone, I ask God that the time that we spend here together is seen as a form of worship to Him, that we opened our hearts to each other, to some type of truth that we try to come together on and trying to understand a terrible situation and hopefully by the end of this a call to action on the type of service that we can provide for people who can't speak for themselves. I really want to start off by saying a couple of things. I want to greatly thank Pastor Barkley, this church, Rabbi, there's Bobby Forrest who came through, who's running for prosecutor attorney of the county. This is not an easy time to talk about this issue, and I appreciate that. It's not an easy time to come and listen to somebody talking about the issue, especially from the perspective that I'm going to give it. And I appreciate that because I've tried so hard since I've come back, both the first time last year and then again this year in August when I got back home, to do just this, to get in front of wonderful people like yourselves that may not have had the complete perspective given to them from somebody who'd been there on the ground. And I didn't get many answers at all. I called on friends and friends of families. Many hospitals that I work in have chaplaincies and pastors that work within them, and I offered to do just this. And I got a lot of, we'll look into that, and I never got a call back. And I think the truth is, and I don't blame anybody for it, it's an uncomfortable conversation in the context of where we live, what we've learned about this issue our entire lives, and how it's played out in the last 2 years. So I want to commend this church, you all, for coming here, because I acknowledge the bravery of even talking about it because it's uncomfortable. And I also frame my conversation, this first 25 minutes, by saying I will do my best, like Pastor Barkley mentioned, in trying to stay very practical and objective about my experience for the next 25, 30 minutes. But I'm a biased individual because I think all people are biased by their experiences and what they see, and my eyes have seen things that make it very hard to be completely unbiased in my language. So forgive me for that, but I'll do my best. The second part is I can't separate my faith and faith in general from this experience, an extremely spiritual experience with people that strongly believe in God on the ground in Gaza, both Christian and Muslim. And they are very open about their faith, so I couldn't hide that part of how I got there, what my experience was like, and why I've done what I've done since I've returned. So now I can start. That was the disclaimers before I start my experience. When this started on October 7th, and also just so you know, I have no Palestinian background. I'm not ethnically Palestinian. My parents are from a different place. I was born and raised in New Jersey. I had never been there before this. I'd been on many medical missions, like Pastor Buckley said. Often I start with a very specific task. I go to all the local hospitals that I work in and pharmacies and pharmacists and say, hey, I'm going on a medical mission to Colombia, Bangladesh, Haiti, wherever I may be going. Can you give me your close to expiring medications so I can take them with me? Because those things don't spoil, they just kind of FDA run out of approval, but we can still use them and still be effective in places where there's resource problems. And so I did that just like that for this trip. And I had been saying a prayer that my religious leader had told me to say when I felt relatively helpless in the backdrop of watching on social media these terrible things happen between October and May of when I initially planned to go, of 24. He told me, listen, Yousaf, you feel helpless, everybody feels helpless, but you have to remember your place in front of God and say this prayer, Allahumma stakhdimna wa la tastabdilna, which in Arabic translates, oh God, use us in your service and do not replace us for our own arrogance or our own disobedience. That open a door for me to help or be of service to your creation. And as I made that prayer over and over and over again and cried myself to sleep with my wife on the couch as we watched videos of the things that we were seeing come through on Instagram and TikTok, I got a call from one of my wonderful colleagues from Med Global, which is an NGO that does medical mission work that I had worked with previously in Turkey and Greece. And his name is John Caller, a pediatrician from Chicago. And he said, hey, Yousaf, we need pediatric care. We need ICU care. We think we're going to be able to get a medical mission group allowed in Gaza. Do you want to be a part of it? And the door opened, and there was no way I was going to, walk away from that. Many people say, Yousaf, it must have been really brave to go. And I said, no, it's the opposite. I made a prayer to God to open the door opened, and I had no choice but to walk through it because I would have been a coward, really. That's not me humble bragging. It really is this. It's so many of us wish we could help in some way, and then doors open, and sometimes, it gets really scary when the opportunity arises. As I gathered the 5 or 6 or 7 suitcases worth of medication and medical supplies like Foley catheters and intubation kits, IV antibiotics and pain medication, and prepped for my trip in May, Rafah was bombed. And Rafah was destroyed. So I take a step back real quick to give you a geography lesson of Gaza. Gaza is a vertical strip of land, a couple of miles wide, about 12 miles north to south. Square mileage, it's just slightly bigger than Little Rock. It's about 15, 20 miles bigger than Little Rock square miles. Little Rock has about 250,000 people, a little less than that. Gaza has 2.2 million. The vast majority of the population lives in the north of Gaza, a place called Gaza City. And so I would say about 1.5, 1.6 million people live in about half of that population, very, very densely populated. When the beginning of the conflict happened, people were pushed south to Rafah. That's where they were pushed. Rafah is a very deserty area that borders Egypt, the Sinai. And I was supposed to go to Egypt, fly into Cairo, and take a bus with a bunch of UN aid workers to go through the Rafah border from Egypt, from Sinai. And about 2 weeks before I went, Rafah was destroyed. The border was completely closed, and I was told your trip is canceled. And so my mom called me and said, the Muslim version of hallelujah, alhamdulillah, your trip's canceled, you're safe. And I said, Ma, you gotta stop praying for this stuff to happen, So what ended up happening is instead of going through Egypt, we went through Jordan the month later in June. We flew into Jordan. You have to understand the dynamic difference. At the border from Egypt, it's the Egyptian military that controls that border on the Egyptian side and the Israeli military that would typically control the other side. Now you had to go into Jordan, which is buffered between Jordan and Gaza by the occupied West Bank, Jerusalem, and the rest of the state of Israel. And so when we got there, we got on a phone call with the WHO that managed international aid workers, with COGAT, which is the military arm of the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, to give us the rule set of what it would be like if we wanted to enter Gaza the next day. The first one was that you were allowed 1 suitcase for a month worth of travel, and that you were not allowed to take anything else with you. If there was a medication that didn't have your prescription name on the bottle, it was going to be discarded at the border. And do not take things like ultrasounds, battery packs, cell phones, iPads, cameras, or anything that could record while you're there. There are 79 international aid workers in Gaza today. I just checked before I got here. It was about 80 the first time I remember I went. And they only let us in on the morning of entry when the 25 people on the bus have exited their term. so that they keep the number of people of international eyes on the ground about 80 to 100. I think it was at its peak. And so we waited that morning really patiently, hoping we'd get in, and we heard, okay, the bus has exited safely, and that's the bus we're going to take in. So we all headed to the border from Jordan, from Amman, Jordan, the capital. And it was myself and 4 other doctors and about 20 some odd aid workers of different types, World Central Kitchen, the administrative staff of IMC, which is an American-based NGO for hospital care, and some other kind of really famous NGOs you've heard of before, the Red Cross and these kind of things, Red Crescent, these kind of things, from all over the world on that bus. And we went into we passed through the bridge, the Allenby Bridge, to get into the Israeli side of that customs experience. And they opened up all our bags and started throwing away about almost everything that we could have in the bag that wasn't essentially food for ourselves and my clothes. Because I took medicine with me. I left 5 bags in Jordan, or 4 bags in Jordan, but we still tried to squeeze the things in that we had heard that we really needed. Things like Tylenol and children's Tylenol, pediatrician, right? Wound care supplies and those types of things. And a vast majority of things were thrown away, and sometimes they let some stuff in. We then took a bus. I got on the bus back on the Israeli side, and we were supposed to go west through the occupied West Bank, south of Jerusalem, to the same entrance that you'd actually go from Egypt, called Kerem Shalom, or Karim Abu Salim, which ironically or unironically means the generous peace. And that's the access point into Gaza. And we got off our bus, and while we were getting off our bus, our driver, who was Israeli, I said, hey, why did we need military personnel to kind of surround our vehicle while we're going through Israel? I mean, you saw it. We went into customs. We have no military arms. We are a bunch of aid workers and doctors and these things. And he said, if the local settlers recognized that you were a bus going into Gaza to give humanitarian aid, we'd attack your bus. And so we need to have military surrounding so that doesn't happen. We then got off of that bus and went into the UN kind of armored vehicles. I had a driver named Mike from the Netherlands, this really kind of big personality, big guy, bald. He'd been doing this trip for the first time about 9 months by that point, back and forth. He'd been working within Gaza and the West Bank for 3 or 4 years before that, and he had a really dark humor to everything he talked about. And he was our driver as we went in. He stopped and said, are you guys ready? Have you guys been here before? And the second he realized the people in his vehicle hadn't, he said, just get ready. Get ready for what you're going to experience. He said, you'll never see anything like this you've ever seen. I said, I've been everywhere. I've been to post-earthquake Haiti, and I've been to the Rohingya where they've been completely, destroyed. He said, no, there's nothing like what you're going to experience. And I thought maybe he was speaking in hyperbole, but I took it for what it was and got in this vehicle. And there's 3 things that hit you hard when you enter Gaza, that hit all of your senses, an attack on your senses. The first is every single building is on the ground in some capacity. And so the visual looks like a post-apocalyptic movie about zombies where the water stations are destroyed and there's bullet holes in the schools, and Mike would say, that over there used to be the police station, that over there used to be and he'd say this kind of with a giggle just because of the absurdity of how he described every building. And I would say, where do people live? And he said, you'll see. You'll see when we get a little more north from where we are today. And the roads were relatively destroyed. Beat Street, which was the famous street that the Romans used to use as the access point from Rome to Alexandria in Egypt, the major trade route. It's called Beat Street, Salahuddin Street, is mostly destroyed now. It's bombed in different areas, and so we had to go off the road to get to the middle area, which was considered the green zone. Before Gaza started, there was 36 hospitals in Gaza. There's 3 remaining that function in some capacity as a hospital, but all 3 of them have been damaged significantly by munitions. So the first is the visual. The second attack on the senses is the moment you enter to Gaza, you hear a very distinct sound you don't stop hearing until you leave Gaza, which is a high-pitched hum of drones. So 24/7, there's different pitches of drones and frequencies above your head the entire time you're there. And you say, Yousaf, how loud was that? And I say, it sounds like your neighbor on a Saturday morning when you don't want them to run their commercial lawnmower that they overpaid for. That's about the sound that you'd hear 24/7. The director of the ICU of Aqsa Hospital told me when we were talking about this later, he said, the sound has become so universal to us that it's become a part of the routine of our slumber. We couldn't sleep without the lullaby of the drones. That drone sound is probably the thing that still affects me the most, which is kind of a strange thing to think about in terms of when I've come back, because it's such a common sound, that high-pitched hum, engine hum, and it takes me back to these places where I would watch children in the courtyard of the hospital, because it was one of the only safe areas you could be, playing and doing things that children do in a courtyard. And the only time they acknowledged the hum is when it stopped, because the stopping of the hum meant that an F-16 was coming behind it because they'd chosen a target to destroy something else. And so the children, when the hum stopped, would either scatter or look up in horror, waiting to see where the explosion was going to come from. The third very palpable attack on senses is the physical feeling of the ground shake about every 3 or 4 hours that I was there, the entire time I was there, for about the month that I was there the first time on my trip. If you've been in a really bad storm in Arkansas and the lightning gets really close and you feel your house shake, that's a every 3-hour occurrence, 24/7, the entire time you're there, except when it's so close that it rattles the windows and rings your ears pretty consistently. Actually, that's wrong. There are no windows. That's another thing you have to. There are no windows left in Gaza. So actually, that's a thing I should restate. There are no windows. In fact, most of the homes or buildings that are left open have sheets on them because the windows have all have broken because of concussive blasts. Those things were the experiences that we had as the first touch of getting into Gaza, and kind of hit you hard, and they stay with you the entire time you're there. We then went to Aqsa Shuhada Hospital, which was right in the middle area, the green zone. The green zone and the red zone, they are kind of what you'd imagine. The red zone is, if you walk in the red zone, you're an enemy. And so you're free for being targeted. If you're in the green zone, less so, but not 100%. There was no doubt in my mind that I was being tracked from a GPS location perspective. That was very clear to us, to all the international doctors that were there, so much so that we recognized that we needed to stay in the hospitals. We needed to sleep in the hospitals. We needed to be there the entire time because it was going to protect the hospitals. If you say, Yousaf, what's the best thing you did while you were in Gaza as a physician? I'd say probably act as a human shield for the hospitals, because I could do nothing else. The patients who came in were often coming in different stages of dead and dying, with trauma that we didn't have the tools to fix, the operating rooms to operate on, the antibiotics to treat for infection, the wound care supplies to cover with gauze, the pain medicine to treat the pain. We had nothing. We had very, very few supplies that essentially had been conglomerated from all the destroyed hospitals into the 2 or 3 hospitals that were functioning when I was there. When those bombs would go off, if it was close enough that I felt the ground shake, we knew that about 30 or 45 minutes later, there'd be an MCI, mass casualty event is what the WHO calls it. And we would get a vast majority of my first trip were women and children, because the targets at that time were large population centers where residents had gotten together after being displaced from the north, often in UN schools and those type of things. If you remember, in this first summer, there was a lot of bombing of UN schools, because that's where the populations had gotten together, because it was the only kind of roof over your head. And so a vast majority of the time, we get children coming in different stages of dead and dying, torn limbs, traumatic brain injuries, and burns. I'm going to get a little graphic because I think it's important to talk about this when as an eyewitness of what I saw. There are 2 things I will never forget, ever, and I could have never been trained for in America to be prepared for medically. One is a term that I wish I never heard before. I never wish ever had to leave my lips, that when the MCIs would come in, children were thrown in this is the trauma bay, literally about this size, actually, of where I'm standing right now, because it was an OB/GYN hospital before this war, and so it wasn't prepared for trauma, but every hospital is a trauma hospital now. And so what would happen is family would come in and throw their child at us and say, please help, help. And we'd put them down on the floor on cold concrete in the trauma bay, because there were no hospital beds left. We didn't have mattresses. Or when we did, we would put multiple children in the same bed. And we would unwrap whatever bandages were put on in the field when they were pulled from the rubble. And a sound, 2 words that would happen every once in a while, and it would shock you every time you heard it, no matter how many times you heard it. You hear somebody say, brain out. And that meant a child's brain matter was exposed when they unwrapped their head bandage. And so what that meant for everybody in the room is we would slide them into the corner because they were going to die, and there was nothing we could do because we didn't have neurosurgical care. We didn't have the ability to place pressure monitors or an operating room that could handle that level of trauma, and we kind of moved them to the sides of the room because we knew that we couldn't do anything for them other than try to comfort them until they died. That wasn't the worst injury, because those injuries usually involve patients that were mostly unconscious. And so they weren't particularly suffering from a cognitive ability of the trauma that they were experiencing. The worst by far for all of us that first trip were burns. And that's because in America, if you have a burn greater than 50% of your surface area, your mortality rate rapidly climbs into the 50, 60, 70% range, even with tertiary care hospitals, plastic surgeons, complicated and advanced antibiotics, and skin grafting. But in Gaza, we were reusing gauze and reusing hemostats. There was no way to keep things sterile. We didn't have autoclaves. We didn't have the tools. And so often what would happen is children would come in with different stages of burns. We didn't have very much in the way of pain medicine to provide them. We'd wrap them up with what gauze we had, and they would die 4 days later from infection. If they didn't die from electrolyte abnormalities before then. And the difference between that and head trauma is they were in pain the entire time that they suffered in the hospital until they passed away. And their families watched them go through this if they had surviving family members. The second trip was quite different than that for me from a patient population perspective. That was just this summer. People were hungry the first time, but there was enough food to not have true starvation. The second trip, there was nothing. There was flour that came in on trucks, 15 or 20 trucks at a time when they needed 600 per the UN recommendations. And so beyond the bombing and the trauma and the lack of electricity everywhere except in the hospitals that had generators, you had everybody terrified about the fact they'd have to return home knowing they didn't have anything to feed their kids. And when I worked with these Gazan physicians and nursing staff that were by now swimming in their scrubs, right? I saw them over the course of a year. I saw them skinny the first time, and I saw them emaciated the second time as they floated in their clothes because there was no new clothes. One of the things I tell people when I speak about this is they didn't just starve the people of Gaza, they starved them of living. Since 2005, there are products banned in Gaza that you couldn't imagine. You couldn't bring chocolate into Gaza without smuggling it in. You couldn't bring certain types of coffee or basil or certain types of vegetables. It was banned from 2006. Up until those 2 years that have started since October 7th, it's just gotten far worse. Dr. Jihad, the same ICU doctor, told me, man, if you can get Bibi to get us some food, if you could just tell him to let me get a cigarette and a cup of coffee, he said, we'd solve this whole thing in a day if he just gave us some nicotine and some caffeine. And it made me realize that the children hadn't seen candy, for months. And I never had enough, unfortunately. My wife did help me smuggle in some lollipops, but they were gone pretty quickly. The second trip, because of starvation, the patient population was quite different than the first one. The first time, it was mostly children and women living in homes and bombs dropping on their homes when they were sleeping. The second time, it was mostly young male teenagers or early 20-something males. And that's because there were only 2 points in the north of food access, a place called Zakim and a place called Kisafim. And the trucks that were supposed to come in, instead of coming in 600 at a time, came in 10 or 15 at a time. And if you wanted your family to eat tonight, you'd send the youngest and strongest in your family, who was often a teenage boy or a 22-year-old boy or one of these things, because they were strong enough and fast enough, and maybe they could get back with the 50-pound bag of flour that could let you survive for the rest of this week. And they would go and they'd return between 3 and 11 p.m. with massive gunshot wounds to the head and neck, some day to the chest, some day to the groin. And I say that because that didn't seem on purpose. Most of the doctors that I've been with since have said it felt like there were days. There were chest days, and there were groin days, and there were head days for where they were all being killed. And they come in 20 at a time, 30 at a time, thrown on the floor without their families because they often came directly from the exit points. I'm going to share 2 or 3 specific stories, and I'm being kind of careful of time. We're probably close to 6:40 if that's okay, but I think I'm moving okay. But there's 3 stories I think I really need to share with you because that's why I've come. One is a story of a 16-year-old boy that I don't know the name of. And that's because he died before I got a chance to ask him. He was thrown on the floor in the middle of the trauma bay in Shifa Hospital. Shifa Hospital used to be the largest tertiary care hospital before this thing started, but now we're functioning out of the outpatient center because the major part of the hospital's been destroyed. You can Google that and see SHIFA, Shifa, which ironically means the cure, completely destroyed. And the child was thrown, 16-year-old kid thrown on the floor, and he had a large wound on his arm, and he was moaning in pain, and I thought that's what was really bothering him, because when I unwrapped his arm first, he had a through-and-through gunshot wound with his humerus essentially shattered. I couldn't find any solid parts of bone there. And so we rewrapped that up, and he continued to moan and groan, and so I unwrapped his head and realized quickly that I was holding his brain in my hands. And he cried for his mother the entire time I unwrapped his head bandage, and he stopped by the time I stopped, because the bandage was probably keeping the pressure in his skull, and the moment I unwrapped it, it dislocated the pressure, and brain matter exited his skull, and he passed away quickly thereafter. I'll never forget that, not because of the trauma and to shock you out of a terrible story, but because he died alone there. Like I didn't know. I loved him for the few seconds. I loved him, like we all love people when we see them suffering. But I never met his family. I don't know if they ever knew where he ended up in the ER. I don't know how big they were. I know that the last moments of his life, he was worried about his mother finding out that he was injured. That's what he was saying. He was worried about the anxiety his mother would have if she knew that he was this badly hurt. He had no idea how badly hurt he was. The other story I'll tell you is of a girl named Roseanne, who is 23 years old. She was a pharmacy student who worked for an NGO called Heroic Hearts. She's a Gazan. You hear a lot about the warnings that people in Gaza receive before bombs are dropped on their homes. She was working in a clinic at the Heroic Hearts organization where they were working on areas where there were tent cities, and she was part of that organization. And she got a call from her father and said, hey, they used to live in an area called Zaytun, which means olive trees, next to the beach. They said, hey, we got a call. They said they're going to bomb our building. You need to get home as fast as you can because we've got to leave and figure out where we're going to go. We don't know where we're going to go yet, and we need you here. And so she started racing home, about a mile walk from where she was. And when she got close, about a quarter mile away, she met somebody who she knew from her neighborhood, and he ran up to her and said, hey, don't go home. It's no longer there. Go see if your family's at the Ahli Hospital. Ahli Hospital is the Anglican hospital in the north. She ran there and found her mother in her last couple of breaths and said to me, when I met Roseanne the first time I met her, a 23-year-old girl said to me, Alhamdulillah, praise be to God, at least I got to see her in her last breath. She saw me at her bedside before she died. The rest of her family, when I met Roseanne, the day I got there, was still under the rubble in Zaytun, because it was still the red zone, and so they couldn't get their bodies. And she had her father, her 7-year-old sister, 15-year-old sister, and 17-year-old sister in the building under the rubble. It was for 2 weeks before I met her that they were still under the rubble. And about the day before I left, so about 5 weeks total from the time that bombing happened to when I left, to when she was able to get them, she told me, hey, Yousaf, they finally are saying that I can go get the bodies. I said, who's going to go? She's like, well, I can't go because I can't lift the rubble, but a couple of my neighbors are going to go and they're going to try to find them. They think that they're in the living room because they were all waiting for me in the living room. And they found her father with her 7-year-old in his lap, and her two other sisters, one in the kitchen and one in her bedroom under the rubble, in different stages of decomposing. They couldn't figure out who was who from the sisters, the two older sisters. And they didn't have a full body, and so what they did was they buried her sisters together, the two sisters, with her mother. They kind of opened up her mother's grave and put her there because all of the graveyards in Gaza are full. And they chose to put her father and her 7-year-old sister together in a grave very close to Ahli Hospital. I said, Roseanne, do you mind if I come with you? Because it was the first time that she was going to visit them at the graveyard. She said, she didn't understand why. I said, just let me come and just be with you, because she had lost her entire family. And we went, me and somebody else from our group, and we stood with her as she picked through which tombstone had a paper on it that had her father and her sister's name because it was somebody else's grave before. And they had to uncover about 3 or 4 feet, place the bodies on top of somebody else, and cover. And I tell you this to say, when I went there, she wasn't the only one looking for someone. There were countless young people, old people, children looking for, through the papers, about who they had lost and when the last time they saw them and how long they were under the rubble. The last story I'll tell you, and I'll conclude there and then open up to question and answer, is that of I have to choose between two because of time. But the first one I'll tell you is, I'll tell you about Abdul Nasser. And I'll tell you this from a spiritual perspective for a second. So Muslims often make a prayer where they say, "Oh God, make it so that my last breaths are my best breaths," meaning like in terms of our faith, that we are strong in our faith until the very end. It's a very common prayer that Muslims make. And to us, the epitome of faith or showing faith is stating the shahada, the witnessing of faith, which is there is only one God and that Muhammad is a messenger. That's a saying that you'll see Muslims say on their deathbed often, because that's what we wish we could say as a declaration of our faith, as the last words we say before we meet God. And I was driving I was told by these guys at the NGO, "Hey, we want to take you to the orphanage where we're doing some good work." And they love to hear that somebody loves them from outside this place because they've never met anybody from outside of Gaza. 47% of Gaza is under the age of 18. 47%, half of Gaza, are children. The besiegement of Gaza started in 2005. And so if you do the math, that entire population plus a couple of years was born in the camp that is Gaza. That has a wall around it, that doesn't let people leave, that controls how much food they get, that doesn't allow them to get jobs and so on. And this is the only life they've ever known. And the orphanage wasn't an orphanage the way we think about orphanages sometimes. Somebody gave up a kid when they were born, or these were traumatic, acutely traumatized orphans that had lost family members, their parents, just within the last 2 years. And so he said, "Hey, can you just come? They'll be so happy if they see you, and they hear that you're American, they'll just want to give you a hug because you came all the way here, and there's people in America that care about us. That would be a big deal." And so I was in the car with these guys as they were driving me there. Their cars, by the way, there's no gas, and so they're using cooking gas. They modified the engines to use cooking gas, and they say all these cars are going to be destroyed because the engines will all die probably in the next couple of years. But this is all we got. And I was in the car, and Abdel Nasser was sitting in the front, and I was between a man named Barat, who's like 24 years old, and Yousaf, who was 32 years old, and they all had families. And we were going to make a left turn into the red zone. I wasn't allowed to do this technically, and I only told my wife this after I got back. But if you get asked by somebody to go, there's no way anybody here with your hearts, you're going to go to put a smile on these kids' faces for a couple seconds. And so we're going to make a left turn, and Abdel Nasser turns around to me, and he has a big kind of smirk on his face, and he says, "Hey, this is when we say the bearing of faith. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa Muhammadur Rasulullah. There's only one God." And they all laughed. The guys around me laughed, right? They were like, "This is funny. We're going into a place that you might get killed. Get ready." That was kind of what they were trying to say. Get your order, get your affairs in order. And I laughed with them, but I wasn't really laughing. I was like, I'm going to say these words really seriously. And I tell people, it probably was the first time that I meant them. That I believed, I understood I was going to face God one day, pretty soon or something like that. And I had to believe what I believed. And I think a lot of what we see from the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine is their relationship with death in that meeting is so much more intimate than ours, because they're surrounded by it every single day. Abdel Nasser later told me the story that I'll conclude on. Actually, I have to conclude on another story. May is the last one I'll conclude on. May was a pharmacist in Aqsa Hospital. She was a young lady, 27 years old, had 3 kids. She wasn't just a pharmacist. She was just that lady who did everything and knew everything about the place. She knew where every medication was staffed in individual pills that different aid workers had bought. She knew, and the day before I left, she said, "Yousaf, you have to come. I have to give you tea. I have to serve you tea because you came all the way from America." I said, "May, you guys are starving. I can't eat in front of you. It's not going to work." And she said, "Do not take away our dignity. Do not take away our dignity to be able to host you. It's who we are. They've taken away so much. Don't let them take away this from us. Let us host you." And so she gave me tea. Sugar bags at that time, by the way, when I was there, was $400 for this much sugar, because there was no sugar. And so and she gave me a big old heaping wad of sugar in my tea. And we sat there in her little pharmacy as the pharmacy people would come to the window and say, "May, we need X." And she'd look around and figure it out and throw it at them and tell us her story. And she told me the story of her sister, Maysoon. May and Maysoon, there's a play on words. Her mom named them similarly. And she said, when Maysoon died, my happiness was gone forever. I knew there was never going to be a day in my life I was ever going to be happy again. But Yousaf, I'm going to tell you something since then. I recognize something that I need to tell everybody who ever hears us, is that we love life. You know, they paint us like we wish to die, and though we are comfortable with death and meeting God, given where we stand today, we love to live. I loved Maysoon before she died because she would throw so many surprise parties for everybody that we knew that it was no longer a surprise. Say, Maysoon, you can't throw a party and call it a surprise every week because it's not a surprise anymore. But she loved to do that for people. That's who she was. She liked to bring happiness into people's lives. And that's what we want. We want to live and watch our kids grow up and be who they're supposed to be. And even though we're comfortable meeting death, we're not scared of death at this point. We'd love to live, and they need to know that we love to live just like they love to live. And Yousaf, I'm going to tell you something important. If this flipped on its head, and we were in the position that they are in, we would never let their children starve. We would never let their kids go hungry. And if you've met a Gazan, and this will actually be the last thing I say. If you met a Gazan, I promise you on my life, you will recognize very quickly that if this flipped on its head, there'd be Gazan mothers cooking for Israeli children tomorrow. I hope with what I said I didn't offend anybody or make you think. I hope you start thinking about things differently. When Pastor gets up here, I want to say something for myself before he even says it on my behalf, even though we talked about this. I do not get offended by your questions. I do not get scared by difficult questions. I've tried my best not to share a lot of my opinions to this point. If you ask me a question, I will share my opinion, and it's just mine. It's just this guy's. It's not his or anybody else's, even people from my congregation. It's just Yousaf's opinion, and I don't want anybody to think anything more than that. But I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you. We have a little bit of time for questions. If you have a well-crafted, well-thought-out question that you would like to put before the group and let Dr. Yousaf respond to, please raise your hand. Saw this one in the back, and then I'll come to you. Can you get as close to me as possible so then
Thank you for coming tonight. So you said you've been to Gaza twice, right? And I'm just wondering how your own personal opinions have changed, before you went to Gaza, then that first time, and then after the second time. How have you kind of personally grown and developed as a result of, those experiences?
Thank you so much for the question. I'll tell you something. The first time I went, I thought when I prayed to God to ask me to use me in his service, that I was going to be a doctor. I thought I was going to go and I was going to do fancy medical things that I had been trained for a decade to do and done a decade since being here in Arkansas, and I did none of those things. I was completely useless. My medical degree was completely useless. But what I did realize, and this is the perception change of a personal perception, was that I knew I had to be a journalist, which is not something I ever wanted to do and I'm not very good at. I had to be a witness to what happened, because if I don't do this, then nobody will ever know what happened. And I say that in the backdrop of understanding that in this conflict, more journalists have been killed in Gaza than any other conflict in the modern era. And there are no journalists allowed in. So the only journalists that I just mentioned that were killed were Gazan journalists that were there from before this started. There is no BBC or NBC or CNN. There are no war correspondents. And if you've wondered and said, that's weird, why hasn't Dana Bash been on the ground in Gaza? It's because she's not allowed in. Because there's extreme restriction on who gets access into Gaza. We sit here 3 weeks after our ceasefire started, and there is still not one international journalist on the ground. And what I recognize since then, the personal thing that's changed in me, not about the politics, but just about my understanding of our role, it's not always going to be what we think it's going to be. And that today, I know that the best thing I could do for the people that I met there was talk about them, because they can't talk for themselves. And I really wish that a year from now, we have a Gazan up here telling their own story from their own mouth, because I hate that I have to do it for them. May should be here telling you about her sister instead of me conveying it as a third-party person, because she loved her more than I do, and she lost her. And so that's been the big impact for me since coming back the second time. I appreciate your question.
What, if anything, gives you hope, either personally or about the situation in Gaza?
The Gazan people are who gave me hope. And what I mean by that is going to be a little bit overly, it's overly religious in a religious place, so it's okay. I usually say that when I'm talking somewhere else. Yeah, that's right, I can't be over. You're good. The people of Gaza never asked or never behave in a manner of like wanting self-pity or pity from people. That's not what they want. Their understanding of what victory looks like is on a timeline much broader than this worldly life. And I felt that with them. And I wish I could tell, we say those things. All of religious people say these types of things. We know that the timeline's long and that God's justice is eternal and that we may not always see it here, but there's a time and a place. I think we share that language across religions and our belief in God. But they mean it and they live it. There was no great anger when I was there. They had every excuse. May had every excuse to be angry about what happened to her sister and her nephews and nieces and her brother-in-law who she loved. But she wasn't. She just wanted to talk about moving forward. And while I was there, I swear to God, while I was there, while bombs were dropping in the background on the second trip, I'd watch men get up on ladders and put towel on a wall in the hospital. They could be destroying the neighborhood down there, but they aren't those. So the hope comes from, they aren't normal. The Gazan people, I'll say it, they're just not normal people. I've been in a lot of places where I've met beautiful people through humanitarian aid work. And a lot of times the cream comes to the top in extreme difficult situations, and resilience is a human character that God gave certain people that's just, it's just in and of itself a sign of God's amazingness and grace. But Gaza, the percentage is so much higher. Everybody was cream when I was there. Everybody was just, children's perceptions of reality were just unlike anything I had ever seen before. When we went to that orphanage, I broke down. I was giving a talk yesterday, and this 15-year-old kid from the mosque said, "Did you cry when you were there?" I said, "The entire time I was there, I cried." Right? And how did you do when you come back? I just cry. There is no coping with what you see. But when you're with those people and they're not crying, and they would tell, May would tell me a story, and I would tear up. And she would say, hey, I'm gonna stop. What are you doing? Are you okay? No, don't worry about it. It's okay. I was like, May, you're making it worse. You're making it worse here. You're making it feel, because not only have you gone through this, but you're different. You're different of the way you see things. And what I'll say is this, and I say this strongly only because you asked the question. They aren't going to lose they just aren't. If you met them, they may lose people. They may lose their health. But in the long run, on a timeline that we don't always understand, they're just not. They carry themselves in a way that's very clear about their understanding and their faith in God. That's just, it's surreal. It's a beautiful thing. The first time I went for them, and the second time I went for me. I know what I experienced the first time I went. I just wanted to be with them the second time.
Another question?
With respect to the deaths that you witnessed or observed in the hospital settings, were you aware of the manner in which they were reported, recorded, and then ultimately made public? And one reason that I ask that is because I've read so many stories where there are hospitals said to be announcing, like whether it was a child or whether it was a male or a female, and then giving a tally, sometimes a daily tally. And then lots of times it seemed like the Israeli government was disputing that count. So I'm just wondering, what do you know about that?
That's a fantastic question, and I have a very specific, very opinionated answer that I'm going to give that's mine. I don't think the number is 60,000, I think it's going to be 300,000 or 400,000 when this is done. And every single doctor that I was with
Will you say that again? I want to make sure people
sorry.
heard.
They're quoting the number 60,000, even the Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, it says 60,000. That's 60,000 names that they know right now that were immediately killed by ammunitions. That's part of your question. They only record the deaths if they're immediately killed in the context of an attack that happened. What they aren't counting, and I think the number is closer to 300,000 or 400,000 easily, and right now if you hear what people are saying, they're saying, oh, there's 1.8 million Gazans. There was 2.2 or 2.3 before we started. That's where I'm getting that number from. I'm not making that number up from nothing. I think 100,000 left in the early part of the war. I think everybody else is either gone or under the rubble. Every dialysis patient in Gaza is dead. When I went to Nasser Hospital, which is one of the 3 hospitals that was functioning, there were bullet holes in every dialysis machine. There were bullet holes in every dialysis machine. And whichever soldier decided to put a bullet in a dialysis machine, they knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't killing young, fit militants. They were killing old people on dialysis. Anybody who had a cancer diagnosis in 2023 is dead. Because chemotherapy doesn't exist in Gaza for the last 2 years. Any chronic illness that required chronic medication, those people are gone. Diabetics, there's no refrigeration, and you can't have insulin without refrigeration. We saw as many diabetic amputations as we did traumatic amputation. And by the way, this is the war that's produced the most child amputees in the history of the world. We saw more diabetic amputations in middle-aged people and elderly people because they didn't have insulin for 18 months, and then we didn't have antibiotics to treat them. And they were living in their own sewage, in rubble. And inevitably they would get a foot wound like you do even in the perfect environment. And it was untreatable in that context. And so if we start including the casualties of war from this war, and in the knowledge of what the weapons that have been used, including classic munitions and also the weapons of war like starvation and limitation of access of medical supplies and those things, the number is going to be heartbreakingly much bigger than we like. And it's why I tell you, if I were to give you a call to action, if you trust what I'm saying at all, yours and mine, number one thing we should be asking for every day as journalists to be allowed in. I'm so confident about what I saw that all we need is somebody to report it. And it'll change, it'll shift everything. There's a reason there's only 80 international aid workers there for 2.2 million people. They don't want me to exist.
Another question? Patrick? Please stand a little close to you.
This is not necessarily a Gaza-specific question. For instance, I'm a paramedic. I've been doing it for 15 years, and it's kind of been on my heart to get involved in medical missions. How would someone, say a nurse, paramedic, something like that, get involved, whether it be Gaza or anywhere else in the world?
It's a great question. So there's 2 answers to that question, unfortunately. Gaza is you're not allowed. You wouldn't be allowed. They won't allow paramedics or nurses in at all at this time. They haven't let them in for about a year or about 8 months. Before that, they were letting nurses in because they have complete control over who gets in. Everywhere else, just come up stage afterwards and I'll give you some wonderful NGOs that, just like the ones I went with. Med Global does work in places all around the world, both in South America, in the Middle East, South Asia, and paramedics with your experience would be a wonderful addition to most of those teams. Because, this is the truth, when you go to these places, and if anybody's done mission work before of any type, you never go doing what you think you're going to do to a certain extent. Right? Most of what we do when we go to these places is primary care in most of the environments I've been. It's helping people with blood pressure and Tylenol and aches and pains and those kind of things. And so paramedics are very valuable in helping operations of a clinic or getting people from the field to the hospital if they're acutely ill. And there's a wonderful way that you can help educate people on the ground in some of these things. And all you gotta do is sign up. It's a Google search away. The first time I did it, I just Google searched medical mission. At that time I was a pediatrician, and I found a bunch of lists, and all it was sign up and going for it. Get your passport and make it happen. It's been the best thing I've ever done in my life, I think, in general, as a plan.
I'll also add a plug. The Diocese of Arkansas, the Episcopal Diocese of Arkansas, sends a medical mission to Guatemala almost annually, for many years, in fact. So if you happen to be Episcopalian and you want to know more about that, please let us know. We probably have time for one more question. Yes.
The news tells us that hospitals and schools were the places where Hamas put their fighters. Can you comment on that?
I can comment very declaratively and objectively on the hospital because I was I visited all 3 hospitals that existed on the ground when I was there. Nasser Hospital, actually 4, because Al-Ahli, the Anglican hospital, reopened. So Ahli Hospital, Al-Shifa Hospital, which is the one that they destroyed in the context of what you said specifically, and it was besieged for about 45 days. And Al-Aqsa Hospital and Nasser Hospital. Those are the 4 hospitals by name I can mention. I walked in them, I walked their hallways, I went in there where they had storage for the supplies that they had, and I never saw anything except for patients, doctors, nurses, and families trying to find a safe place to live. Aqsa Hospital had a capacity of 70 beds. That's what it was, 70 patients, labor and delivery. That was their major goal of the hospital. When I was there, were 700 people in the building. Because there were people living in the hallways, their families. If you came in sick in the hospital, your family would take advantage of that, and not in a bad way. Common sense-wise, because it was a place over your head, and they would stay with their family member on the floor in the hallway. And I never saw I can only tell you what I saw. I swear to God, in this place. That I never saw anything more than people trying to survive and find a safe place to live, and the medical people trying to take care of them. Schools I can't speak to because I never visited a school. What I will say, if it's okay to say, is I take a step back when I hear that really common language used in regards to this. And I take a great offense to it because we don't use that language in any other similar or analogous situation. We don't say downtown Little Rock has a huge gang problem. Let's bomb the Jesus out of downtown Little Rock so we may get rid of all the gang members. And we don't care who else we kill. We don't do that. We don't have that. We don't destroy the bank for the bank robber that has hostages. We don't kill everybody in the bank and go, hey, tough luck, guys. Sorry, it was a tough. We had to get rid of the guy. We don't do that in this context. And so if we're going to frame the justification of destruction of large residential places where we knew the majority of people were innocent people, because there may have been a bad guy around, I don't adhere to that logic or thought process on humanity or the way that we're supposed to handle these things in warfare. As a believer in God, that's a justified way of seeing so many dead people. It doesn't work for me regardless. Does that answer your question a little bit? Appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Let me end tonight by offering, there are innumerable helpful ways to be part of the solution. I'm going to offer you the one about which I know the most and which I trust. And that is, if you wish to provide financial resources that will, particularly with Ali Hospital, the Anglican hospital in Gaza City, then you can go to the website of the American Friends for the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem. That is the organization of which I'm a part specifically supports St. George's College. But the American Friends are the primary way that Anglicans in the United States, Episcopalians in the United States, can get financial resources on the ground directly to the Archbishop's office that can then support as possible the work of Al-Ali Hospital in Gaza City. The American Friends of the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem. I'll vouch for them. Here's what I'll say. I hope that you now count, as I do, Dr. Ahmad Yousaf as your friend, because familiarity breeds understanding, understanding breeds empathy, and empathy drives us to strive for peace and justice for all of God's people. So I want to thank you, my friend, for being with us tonight. You sure may, please.
I meant to, I sometimes start this way, but I got distracted. My wife reminds me of all the things I forget to say right after I leave these things. So and I see her looking at me this way. So this is what I like to say about eyewitness testimony. What we've learned as a scientist or as somebody that watched the news or a historian is that the way that we validate information of being truthful and honest or viable or working on information is you get an eyewitness testimony, an observation in a science experiment, and you say, hey, that's interesting. That's one observation by this guy. But he may be biased. He may have an agenda. He may be blind. He may have been tricked. He may have been duped about what he saw. And so the way you validate that information is you go and you see if it's repeatable. And the thing I offer as my pleading to you is be cynical about the information you receive from me today, and go and find every single physician from America, the UK, the Netherlands, Australia, from every single place in the world that's been to Gaza in the last 24 months. Go find them. I promise you they've done what I've done today. And they told their first eyewitness testimony. And if you get 20 people, you say, huh, that's pretty interesting. And if you get 50, then you probably have some serious stuff to work on. And I am so confident that they have the same story I do that I will give you their names, because I'm on a big old chat with a bunch of them all around the country. Americans from places like Arkansas and Texas and California and New York and Ohio, even New York, all these places. And I can give you their names, and they would love to tell you what they experienced firsthand on the ground. And ask them your questions. That's how you verify information. That's how you know it's real. So I challenge you to do that as part of this kind of exercise, and I appreciate you again so much for letting me come.
Can we please give Dr. Yousaf a big hand? Dr. Yousaf will be in the narthex. Ahmad, why don't you go out there to see people as they leave? Friends, please go in peace.